Well, I'd just like to extend my gratitude for the invitation to talk here at the famous Fort Ligonier and at this wonderful 7 Years War Symposium. I've learned a lot this morning, so thank you to the earlier speakers. I appreciate your work. So what we're going to talk about is something that people have been trying to unravel and trying to understand since Europeans set foot in North America. And the indigenous populations of North America are so diverse, you know, and unique, actually, culturally unique, that it'd be really impossible to try to even attempt to sort out every single nation that was involved in the French and Indian War period, right? Really hard. So I'm just trying to focus on the Haudenosaunee people, and like I say, early ethnographers have been trying to do this since the 17th century. Probably Lafitau, the Jesuit priest, did the first sort of attempt at understanding it. Lafitau worked mostly with Mohawk people from Ganawage, but did mention that he learned a lot from Chaumonot among the Seneca. He learned everything, he said, about the Iroquois people from Chaumonot among the Seneca. But anyways, that's what we're going to try to do, is try to explain leadership, and when you see names and you see so-called chiefs in the literature, like, who are they? Particularly Haudenosaunee, all right? What do they represent? How do they fit in their own cultures? How do they fit in the grand scheme of things? And so the first, let's see, this is the clicker, right? So who are chiefs, right? This is an English word. It's sort of been a label that has been applied to all kinds of leaders in Native communities. And it has really today no meaning to Native people. You know, it really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't come with any, particular specific set of responsibility or power or influence. So when we see the word chief, what does that mean? Like, who are they, right? So the most recent scholarship that really has attempted to kind of define amongst the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, their leadership structure was William Fenton in his really powerful book, the Iroquois and the Great Law. I think that's the title. And he did a fair job. He was focused on a specific set of leaders, though. And those are the what we're going to call sachems, okay? And because we're using the English language, we're going to use the term sachem or counselor. The term counselor kind of came out of the late 19th century, and Iroquoian, say, historians, people who were sort of writing down the ideas and the structure and the law that the Haudenosaunee people developed, they became more interested in using the term counselor because it fit more with the Native concept, okay? So who are these counselors or sachems? That's what we're going to talk about. Who are those individuals? We're going to talk about these individuals we call today a seat warmer in English. These are the sequential inheritors of the sachemship titles, okay? They are installed immediately on the passing of a sachem, and they hold the position until a large condolence can happen. So a condolence, we'll get into it a little bit more in depth down the road here, but is simply the process by which a person is laid to rest and a new person is put in place. Then we have these individuals who are called eyes and ears, Heodano, and their term or their title, their job, means that they guard the tree. And these are people who can be installed and used temporarily, and their title does not go with them. They don't pass it on to anyone. They're just simply an official officer that was sanctioned by the Sachem ships and their clan mothers. Then we've got this kind of category here, which is really a catch-all category. And these are more or less positions of meritocracy. And they are leaders who emerge for whatever reason on a community level, a village level, even a family level. And they have, by their own merit, been able to be influential. And more or less they serve their community or their family, you know, at the discretion of their constituents, you might say. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at them. And then lastly, we have an official title which is given out, but they don't play very often into the scheme of history that we're talking about, although there were very famous pine trees. If you've heard of Thayendanegea, Joseph Brant, he was regarded as a pine tree chief. He held no official sachemship title, and even though, you know, others have regarded him and given him an elevated position because of his influence, because of his charisma, his ability to influence, he really did sort of gather quite a bit around him, but he really held no official titles in the sachemships. So we're gonna break it all down in this kind of categories. When Fenton did it, he was more focused on the first and second ranks that we're talking about here, the sachems. He was really kind of focusing on that. The difficulty is when you start looking at these leadership roles is that sometimes they change, and sometimes, depending on the point in history, people who were, we'll say at the, there we go. People who were at the war chief or village chief level end up becoming sachems later. Although they don't have, there's not a newspaper article from 1740 that says this guy, you know, moved into a new position. And this difficulty is compounded by the fact that these sachemship titles come with a new name. So, ignore that last slide, I don't know why it's still in there. This is the term that we use more or less today, and this is the term that was used historically, hoyane, and that is the term for a Confederacy sachem. Okay, so I'm just going to continue to try to use the term sachem. That way it's not confusing to you. These individuals, these are all men, they are put into position directly from the women. And so most of these conferences, when we talk about war and this colonial history, we're always talking about men, but we're going to spend some time talking about women, because in Haudenosaunee culture, they play an important role in who is actually installed as leadership titles. So these women, these great women, are called clan mothers today, and they are the ones who actually install these sachems into their positions. They use a wampum belt as the tangible manifestation of their authority. This belt here represents the women's authority to elect sachemship titles, and the figures on it represent the women who are linked arm in arm, and the black spot, it represents the candidate, the one that's being proposed. Where do these candidates come from? Well, turns out there's no election process. Actually, Iroquois people would say that anybody who wanted any kind of a leadership title is probably the last person you should elect. Because the position in this case, the sachemship, comes with only headaches and worry and suffering and tremendous responsibility that weighs on a person. There's no benefit, no material benefit to it. So there's a list that I put together from a number of different sources, but mostly from John Arthur Gibson. And this list kind of goes through and explains some of the rights and responsibilities of Haudenosaunee women and clan mothers. And it's a really interesting list. And maybe I should even take the time and read it for you, you know. So the first one, the descent of blood, which gave citizenship to her family. The word is owachile. It means like the fire. Your family is a fire. And what they're saying is that amongst the Haudenosaunee people, each nation has a unique number of families, or clans. In English, we'll call them clans. And each clan has a leader who is a woman. And so you have the family or clan level, and then you've got the leader, the head of the clan, which is a woman. And she sometimes has officers, and she sometimes has helpers, but we're just going to go into the basics because I don't want to totally confuse you. But this woman is more or less the one who's responsible for her clan. And because the Haudenosaunee people are matrilineal, she passes on her lineage and her family clan to her descendants. Haudenosaunee people are exogamous, and they have to marry outside of their family, right? They have to marry outside of their immediate family, which is a good idea for a lot of people. But furthermore, they say anybody within your clan, regardless of nation, is actually in your family too. So you marry somebody away from your clan, outside of your clan. And so what that means is, if you're a young man, you have, and your mother is, we'll say a bear clan, and your father maybe is a turtle clan, right? So you and your siblings are all bear. Your sisters will remain there in the house with your mother and father. You marry somebody from another family and end up moving in with them in their house, in their town, village, community, or whatever. And so this is an important distinction. And then that you, as a young Bear Clan man, when you have children, they're the children of your wife's family. So you don't pass your lineage on or your nation to your children, okay? So that comes into play. The titles of the several chieftainships of her family belongs to her. These are the seats of the Sachems, right? We're using a metaphoric term. These are the seats, or the names and the titles are all the same thing. They're owned by the women. The right to hold councils, such as those for chiefs and war chiefs, that belongs to her. The right to ownership over the house and the furnishings and all of the equipment belongs to her. Her children belong to her. The right and the use of occupancy of the land shared by her family and her clan as the source of basically the economy of your community, that belongs to her. The sovereign prerogative of selecting from her brothers and sons the candidates for the chieftainships of her family belongs to her. So she is the one who selects from her brothers and her sons who are from her clan for these titles. And furthermore, the concurrent prerogative of initiating a procedure for removal of these leaders for cause belongs to her. So these chieftainships, these sachemships, they serve the clan mother, and they at her discretion. And she has the right, if they're not following her directives, to not only right, be responsible to remove a bad leader from office. That is her right. And then you've got things like the prerogative of adopting aliens. So creating new citizens in her clan belongs to her. The authority of forbidding her brothers and sons from going to war belonged to her. Also, to initiate a war. The right of granting life or decreeing death to foreign prisoners of war belongs to her. Responsibility for managing the public treasury belongs to her. In terms of treasury, in terms of economy, we're talking about foodstuffs. We're talking about wampum belts, things which were owned, by the entire community. Those were the responsibility of the women and the clan mothers. The ability to provide by public levy foods required for festivals, ceremonies, general assemblies, or for treaties, or for public charity belong to her. So she can actually go through and administrate the economy in a way of her community. That administration falls to her. And then, maybe even most importantly, the ownership over her own person belongs to her. And that actually should be extended to all Haudenosaunee people. All Haudenosaunee people belong to themselves. Okay, you have a right to yourself, and you determine for yourself what you would do with that life. There are 50 of these sachemships, and each nation of the Confederacy has its portion. It's hard to say why they have specific numbers of chiefs, of sachems, in this, at this level. You might say as almost a federal council level. It's hard to say, but sometimes it's related to the number of clans that the nation has. Sometimes it's related to populations and things that happen over time, historic things, which could add to your communities. So this belt, or this wampum here, is called the Chief's Wampum, and it is the representation of the 50 council or sachem seats. And so each strand coming off of that ring represents one title, and it's broken up into different categories according to the nation. So the Haudenosaunee people, that is referring to what we consider the 5 nations, or the Iroquois Confederacy, or even the 6 nations later as the Tuscarora join. But we're not going to talk much about Tuscarora, and there's a reason why. So these sachemship titles are parts of clans. So I'll just give you an example. The Mohawk Nation is entitled to 9 seats. They have 3 clans, 3 original clans among the Mohawk: Turtle, Wolf, and Bear. Those 3 clans are the same. They appear in each one of the Confederacy nations, each member: Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. They have, each one of them has at least the 3 clans, but many of them have more. So like the Senecas have 8 clans. These titles do not fit perfectly into a system where you'd have, like the Mohawk system is pretty perfect actually. You have 3 clans and 3 chiefs for each clan. It works out really nice. They have 9 chiefs. It seems like really, sort of nicely distributed. But other nations don't, like the Senecas, for example. 3 or 4 of their clans don't have chieftainship titles. If you want to know why, you got to catch me later, because we can't talk about 17th century stuff now. Okay, we've got to keep moving. This is the current sachemship titles today that are filled, both in the United States reservations in New York and the Canadian reservations. So you can see, look, right now, as of this spring, that's the percentage filled of the full council. And so those numbers change over time because people pass on, and then that creates a new problem to put new members in. And today there's all kinds of modern concerns. But I want you to know that this system that I'm talking about of chieftainship, the sachemship title, Federal Council of Haudenosaunee Leadership continues, and it remains the last Aboriginal pre-Columbian Aboriginal government. It's the last one that is still in functioning order today in all of North America. Everybody else has adopted or changed and modified their leadership roles. Of the 570 other nations in North America, this is the only one. So these chiefs are widely regarded as carrying horns. This is a metaphor. and it means that these horns of authority are placed on the head of the sachems by their clan mother. This is just a headdress with antlers on it that a lot of people have looked to for as being an early horned headdress anyways, even though it's attributed to Tecumseh. It might be Iroquoian. But the antlers of authority are both today, like in modern times, a literal headdress that these leaders will wear at times, but they're more concerning a metaphorical pair of horns. And so it was explained to me that the horns that these leaders wear, the deer antlers, is because the people rely on that leader just like we rely on the deer for sustenance, right? In another sense, the horns are actually wampum strands, and sacred wampum is used as the official sort of sanctioning document that each sachem receives. It's a strand of purple and a strand of white, and my friend Jamie explained it pretty clearly. He says there's two horns, two strings, one's white and one purple. And when the sachem dies, the purple represents his death, and it gets sent out to all the people by a runner, which is an official role, official job. And then when they put them back together, that's when the new sachem is installed, and the process continues. These leadership roles are for life. They don't come with any retirement benefits. There's no Camp David. You don't draw a salary. In the early days, these individuals were, just like everyone else. And they say that all of the trees in the Confederacy are at an equal height. That's the metaphor. In other words, leaders don't appear higher up or more important or more prominent than anyone else. They're just like everybody else. Except for these two. So there are two sachemship titles which emerged at the time of Confederation, which I don't even want to get into how long ago this occurred. At some point prior to Europeans arriving in North America, this Confederacy was created. We don't know how long ago. A long time ago. And in the story, the narrative, which is recited every year today, even, the narrative will take a week to tell. I have like an hour. We're not going to do the whole story, but in the story, two of the men who encounter this figure they call the Ganawita, this man who had this idea of confederation, of a law that would unite them all. These men could and continued to hold dual roles as a sachem and as a war chief, and they, because of that, these two names, Skanawadi and Degalihoga, these two names appear in the historic record often, from the 17th century into the 18th century. And you think, man, these guys live a long time. It's not. It's the name which is the same. The individual who holds the name changes. So you may see from 1669 the Galehoga in a document, and then you might find him in 1755. Again, and you think, wow, this guy he's amazing. He's Methuselah. He's not. It's just a new person holding the name. Okay, that can be confusing. Anyways, so on to our main subject, which is the war chief, village chief, patriarchs, and big names. Okay, lots of people have tried to unravel this, and the only way I can explain it to you with some clarity is that these roles are temporary. These roles emerge and die away. Sometimes, because of the colonial timeline, we have new communities forming multicultural communities forming, indigenous multicultural communities forming, and leadership coming in and ideas coming in from other nations, which was very difficult to, it was very hard for Haudenosaunee people to evolve a system which could accommodate for those. So what happens is you have more or less these big names emerging as leaders. Now sometimes they have an official capacity. We'll talk about some people who actually appear and have an official role, an official capacity, and more or less a title, but it's a challenge to try to get your mind around it, and you really have to, if you're really desperate to know more about it, you have to follow and trace one individual and to figure out where were they born, what clan were they from, where did they move to, did this person show up at Logstown, or later in other places in Detroit, and like what was their role in those places, and then you begin to understand and read their speeches, what they say, if they say anything that's been recorded, and that can help you understand what category of a leader they fall in. I can confidently say that beyond those two dual purpose sachems, you very rarely see any of those titles from this list in historic literature. Very rarely. You see it more often in the 17th century, in the 18th century even less so. Because these individuals, here's something that's important, they really don't travel well. They have to stay in their community. They're making decisions on the level of their community and their nation, and they don't, like I said, they don't get vacation time, so they can't be flying all over the place. Those sachems designate eyes and ears, or even a voice to them and to other big names or pine trees to do that travel for them. The problem is that during the colonial period, those men who are now traveling and acting as the voice for their chiefs or sachems suddenly feel like they're wielding a little bit more power and influence, and so you might see them popping up and pushing their way into treaty negotiations and kind of exerting themselves in places where they probably shouldn't. That's a positive in some cases when you want to enter into a treaty with we'll say the English about territory, and you have a bunch of these non-sachems signing the treaty. You can always go back and say it was an unofficial document, our leadership did not sign that. It's a negative when, you can see the negatives for having unsanctioned or unofficial leadership. Greed can play into it. Oh, sorry. So we're going to talk about these chiefs, these leaders that are at the local level. We'll call them headmen, we'll call them big names, or this is the Seneca term, Hasinawane, means that he has a great name, a big name. So we're going to talk about a couple of them because it's good to look at the profiles of these people. So during the French and Indian War, there's an interesting event that takes place in 1759 when the British decide to attack Fort Niagara, and which is being commanded by Pouchot. And we have an interesting sort of dynamic that occurs. The British show up, and they have Sir William Johnson with them, who is the leader of the British Indian Department, more or less the one who is managing Indian allies in the French Indian War period. And he brings in many hundreds, I think like 900 at this point, to the siege at Fort Niagara. And there are Mohawks with him, there are Senecas, there are other native allies. But this man, Gayande or Gayandeze, is a Seneca headman who is in sort of leadership role, unofficial leadership role, over the Seneca families that are living at Fort Niagara, which could be like 75 people or more. We're not even really sure. Fort Niagara is, at the, where the Niagara River flows into Lake Ontario. It's a very strategic position militarily, And you know, in the 1720s, the Haudenosaunee people allowed them to construct a trading house, they called it, and which blossomed into what we're looking at here. This is a view of Niagara from across the river. It's a really nice view. If you want to look this up, James, I always say, take my hat off to James Peachy. Thank you, James, for such great illustrations. This is the French castle here, for example, if you're familiar with the fort. This is the gate of the Six Nations here. This is the bottoms of the lowland where a lot of homes were. David Hill had a home down there. But anyways, my point is that when the British show up with their native allies and a siege of the fort develops, you have Senecas living at the fort. And more or less, they had been running, in a way, they were contracted to run the portage. You had to get stuff from the bottom here to the top, and so running a portage meant like carrying things from the ships to the top. And so the Seneca had negotiated themselves, this man Guyande, or Guyandese, had agreed to support the French, as some Western Seneca communities tended to do, to support them in this economic sort of agreement that they're going to run the portage. They can live in the environment of the fort. They had free access to the fort, of course, wonderful trading house, and they lived comfortably, you know, in that kind of enterprise. And so, knocking on the door, all these British and your cousins, you know, who are coming to attack this guy, your French commander. And Guyandese realizes that he's got to do something. Like, this is a bad situation. One of the things that Haudenosaunee people have always been, and historically reticent to do, is to fight one another in open combat. They always try to negotiate a way around it. And so, you know, when you have this situation, a siege, like the siege of a fort with like with lines and trenching and like mortars with explosive rounds, you know, it's a wild scene. Native people don't fit well into that kind of a military context, and so Guyandese begs Pouchot for accommodation, and he asks them, you know, he wants to go out and talk with his native brothers out there, and Pouchot's kind of happy at that, because you know, any way that they could remove part of those soldiers from the equation, native warriors, would be good. So they literally force a ceasefire, and under a white flag, Guyandese walks out of the fort into the British lines and talks with his Haudenosaunee brothers, and they have a meeting, and then, you know, over a period of a few days, back and forth, this ceasefire occurs to allow these native people to hash things out. It's an incredible moment that takes place, you know, during a siege, to do that. But we'll get to what happens, right? So one of the individuals that comes in from the British lines, from the British side, is this man Collier Pendu, and I don't speak French, so if somebody wants to pronounce it more clearly, please go ahead. But they call him the Hanging Belt. Probably that's some kind of sort of a misunderstanding of his name. His real name is Gassuent Danillo, which means a good belt, means a good or a beautiful belt. But this guy's pretty interesting. He was on the upper Ohio by about 1750. He represents that class of war chief, right? And, you know, he was actually around here in 1754 with Washington. He shows up. He was with Braddock. He was against Braddock in 1755. No, he was with Braddock, I'm sorry. And he spends a lot of time with individuals like Tanagreason and a guy named Scaluyade. And so these are names that you might be more familiar with the local history here. So he comes into the fort with two Cayuga chiefs, and they work things out, and turns out that they arrange for the entire native contingency that is with Sir William Johnson to remove themselves from the siege, almost everyone, remove themselves down upstream to a place called La Belle Famille. And they stay there. And they sort of do not engage, which is amazing too. But Galban, who had, in the sort of rhetoric of the period, said that he had held the hand of his French father, and he clasped it firmly, he says, and he will not let go. And it was a recommitment to him that he's going to remain in the fort, stay with them to the bitter end. And he says, my women and my children, my people will remain here with you. And they make a big show. And Pouchot, the commander, actually lays out a ceremony they call covering the grave, which is like when a native leader dies. Covering the grave was a set of gifts that were given out at the funeral to show and express their regret and how they grieve over the lost leader. And so Pouchot lays out a coat, a musket, a kettle, things which were customarily buried with native people at the time. And he does that, in front of the living Seneca leader as a show of like, well, now you're not going anywhere, because your grave has been prepared for you. And so it's this great moment where the Senecas are going to stand with their allied French leaders. And a couple days later, the mortars are exploding, and the bombs are going off, and things are getting pretty hairy. And Galban goes to Pouchot and says, hey, that thing we talked about the other day, my family wants to leave. What do you think? Can we get them out of the fort? And they do. They end up leaving the fort. But before they do, they release all these livestock that the fort was relying on, and actually bring them to the British and butcher them for them, and then they leave. So much for the pageantry of a burial. Okay. I have images for you to look at, just to look at because you can just sit here and listen to me, but cool images are great to look at. So let's pretend that that's the hanging belt, okay? So I want to talk about another leader that emerges, and it's kind of important. His story is really important because he becomes such a powerful voice for the Confederacy. You're probably all familiar with Red Jacket, Seneca leader. His name is Sachems. And the reason why I bring him up, even though he's a person who emerges more during the American War for Independence, the reason I bring him up is that the discussion about Red Jacket becomes it becomes a talking point to define exactly what I'm going through with you today. It becomes a talking point for another Seneca to try to explain and unravel this system of leaders to a white audience in particular. And this is an early image of Red Jacket. Anybody familiar with this image? This is by the Baroness Hyde de Neuville. It was done in the early 1800s. Young Red Jacket. This is probably a more famous image of Red Jacket that you can see. But so Red Jacket emerges. He's signer of treaties, powerful voice. They say the greatest orator that had ever lived amongst the Haudenosaunee people. Jousted with the British verbally and in treaties. Was skillful in the 1790s up into the 1820s even, and as a voice for the Six Nations. But he never held a sachemship title. He never was one of those sanctioned official leaders. And so Ely Parker, another famous Seneca person, writes to his friend William Bryant in 1884. And I'm going to read this whole thing to you because it really is helpful to hear from a Seneca voice about these matters. And he writes him because of the question of who is Red Jacket and why is he a chief? And so Ely writes, "You say you have always been led to believe that Red Jacket did not belong to any of the noble or aristocratic families in which the title or distinction was hereditary. Also, was his mother of noble birth?" And he writes, etc., etc. "Let me disabuse your mind of one matter in the outset. Such a thing as aristocracy, nobility, class, caste, or social grades was unknown among the Iroquois. A political superiority was, perhaps, given by the founders of the League to the Mohawks, Onondagas, and Senecas, who were styled as brothers, and were addressed as fathers by the Oneida and the Cayuga, who were also brothers, and yet also children. Nor were the Turtle Bear and Wolf clans invested with the first attribute of nobility or aristocracy, because there were also the elder brothers and cousins to the other clans. I am of the opinion that no purer and truer democracy or more perfect equality of social and political rights ever existed among any people than prevailed among the Iroquois at the time of the discovery by whites. Often at that time, and since persons attaining positions of prominence and power by their superior intellectual abilities or their extraordinary prowess and success on the warpath. Conspicuous examples of this fact are Joseph Brant and Red Jacket. Successes of this kind, however, brought only temporary and ephemeral distinction to him, his family, his relations, his clan, and perhaps reflected some honor on his tribe. But this accidental distinction was not transmissible as a rightful or hereditary one, and was retained only so long as the intellectual superiority, military prowess, or personal bravery could be maintained by the person or family. When declining years broke one's intellectual and physical power, some younger person immediately dropped in to fill the gap, and the old warrior fell away into obscurity. Thus, it is easily seen how the hand of power and distinction could be constantly shifted from one person or family to another, and could never remain settled longer than he or they were able to uphold the qualities entitling them to the supremacy. The founders of the League may or may not have considered this question in the organization they made. They perfected a confederacy of tribes, offered by 48 hereditary sachems or peacemen and 2 hereditary military sachems or chieftains. They ignored the individuality of persons and families and brought the several tribes into the closest relationship by the establishment of common clans or totemships, to whom was confided the hereditability of the League officers. It was purely accidental circumstance that some of the clans and some of the tribes were not endowed with sachemships, and that others got more than one. And that's not true. We know now why. For example, the Seneca people, they have 8 hereditary clans, but their chiefs only come out of 5 of those clans. The reason being that in the 17th century, in a nutshell, in the 17th century, Seneca people absorbed entire other nations into their political body, and those new or adopted nations could not get titles because of the hereditary way in which titles were passed along. And so it could not come into them. So clans like the Deer clan, they don't have a chief, or the Heron clan, they don't have a chief, because those clans were absorbed with those people who came into the Seneca nation. Does that make sense? And because the chieftainship titles from the beginning descend through clan families, then those individuals, those from those clans, could never have sachemships of their own. Does that make sense? Okay. So he goes on to explain, this idea of Indian social grades with titles is all a vain and foolish fancy of the early imaginative writers who are educated to believe in such things, and the idea is retained, used, and still disseminated by our modern susceptibles who love and adore rank and quality, and who give and place them where none is claimed. So what he's saying is the concept that you might be presented with, that the Iroquois leadership is hereditary, is not so. It is not a monarchy, because a monarch passes down their crown to a direct descendant, right? A son. But in the Iroquois way, the son is not from the father's family. And so the man, being a chieftain or sachem of his clan, his son is from a different clan, and that son would never be able to receive that title from him. So it does descend through a matrilineal lineage, I guess, a matrilineage, but not father to son, which is the European fashion. It is a matrilineal descent that it happens. But it doesn't, and here's the other confusion. The people in your clan are called your brothers and sisters, your nephews and uncles. And so if they say this sachemship title was inherited by one of his brothers, it doesn't mean a blood-related brother necessarily. It simply could mean a clan-related brother. A nephew or an uncle even is not necessarily blood kin, except that when you consider that everybody in your clan would be considered your kin. You see what I'm saying? There's a distinction between what is this bloodline descent and clan line descent. And that's where the confusion comes from. So you may encounter that when you read about Iroquois people, that it is, descent of blood. It's not so. He says, I do not deny that Loyane in Mohawk, in Senecas they say Hoyane, in the Mohawk means lord or master. But the same word, when applied to terrestrial or political subjects, only means counselor. The Seneca word, Hoyane, means the counselor. Hoyane Goa, the great counselor. These names are applied to the League officers only, and the term great was added to designate them more conspicuously and distinguish them from a great body of lesser men who had forced themselves into the deliberations of the League counselors. The term Hasanawane, the great name, is given to the last body of men, a body now known as chiefs. They were never provided for, and as I believe were never contemplated by the League originators, but they subsequently came to the surface, as I have hereinbefore set forth, and forced a recognition of their existence upon the great counselors, and on account of their following and ability were provided with seats at the council board. Red Jacket was one of these chiefs. He was supremely and exclusively intellectual. He was a walking encyclopedia of the affairs of the Iroquois. His logical powers were nearly incontrovertible, at least to the untutored Indian generally. In his day, and to the times I'm referring, the great counselor's word was his bond. It was more of weight and consequence than the word of a chief. Red Jacket knew this well, and while he could not be made a League officer, he used every means by which his wisdom and cunning could devise to make himself appear not only... I lost myself here. Not only the foremost man of his tribe, but of the League. He was ever the chosen spokesman of the matrons of the tribes. He was the spokesman of visiting delegations of Indians to the seat of government, whether state or federal, in the signing of treaties, though unsuccessfully opposing them in open council. It goes on. But this is where the confusing aspects of this leadership. So if you know who is a sachem, you have a listing of those sachemship titles, more often than not, the ones that you're reading about in your history books are great names, village chiefs, or war chiefs. So we're going to talk about a couple of different individuals now. We've talked about the standard, and this is kind of the ones in between. I would encourage you to look at Chainbreaker's War, or the which is a narrative of the events of the 18th century by a Seneca who was there, and this is him. Chainbreaker's War, and there's another book on Chainbreaker which is equally valuable. I don't know the title of it though. So there are two individuals who have been called head war chiefs. And these individuals, these people, are an official title. In other words, their name is the title, and the individual who holds it changes over time. And these are the two exceptions to what we say is a war chief, which is sort of a role gained by merit. These are actual head war chiefs. Now, they are not necessarily the ones who would conduct war, although many times they are, and Chainbreaker definitely was in his time. But they aren't necessarily, that isn't their primary function. Their function is to be the voice of the war leaders, of the war chiefs. They are the head war chief, or the voice to council. So they end up being two titles. So the one is his name here is Dewanyas, and he's been called the chain breaker. He's been called the all breaker. Today, when you say Dewanyas, it means it's a wire cutter. It could mean a lot of things, but this is a name which existed like the other 50 sachemship titles. At that time, it was created at the founding of the Confederacy. The other is Soseowa, which is the great burden strap. They always come from these clans, the wolf and the snipe. They always come from them. Although the individuals can come from other nations, but they have to be from that clan. And they're like I said, they don't necessarily conduct war, although they can. Their primary function is their voice of the war chiefs to the Grand Council of Sachems. Does that make sense? It's like the highest ranking general, maybe, in the US system. And then, well, Blacksnake is great because he was there, and he writes down in his narrative things that took place, and then as an adult, or as a more mature warrior, a more mature war chief, he ends up given this title. So you can look him up, but those are the two exceptions, and when you see their names, either Dewanyas or Zonozoa or Zoneowa, those are specific people with a specific function. And so who is the warrior class? Who are they? Hodiskangate-da. That word means they're carrying, it can mean a couple things, but it literally means that they're carrying a mat. They're carrying a mat. But it can also mean that they're carrying the rust, actually, which is like the red ochre paint. The native languages have all kinds of connotation and meaning, which is defined by context. So whatever way the word is used, you understand it in that way. So, but that's what the word means, Hodiskangeta. It means they carry the mat. And who are they? Well, that's everybody else. That's all the other men in the communities are the warrior class, the warrior ranks. When a person is removed from their office, they say they fall into the warrior ranks. Or if a title is taken from somebody, which is a tremendous shame, they fall back into the warrior ranks. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means a couple things. They're eligible for war. They're entitled. They can make war, they can bring war. It also means that they don't have to if they don't want to. Just because you're a warrior does not mean you have to go to war. This is the wording is Hodiskangeta. It's not warrior or soldier. It means they're carrying the mat. And as my friend who is now long past explained to me in Seneca, it really means that they're eligible to carry the mat. They're eligible to bring the mat to war. It doesn't mean that they do it every day, because not everybody's at war every day. And this is sort of another confusing aspect of the Haudenosaunee people, is that we have all these rules and all these systems and laws and everything, and yet you don't have to follow them, because you have individual free will, and you own yourself. And you can decide for yourself what you do, where you go, and whether or not you participate or not. You could travel from the Mohawk Valley to the gates of Fort Niagara and decide, this is not for me, and you just go home. And there's really nothing anybody can do other than try to compel you, try to talk to you, and try to continue to get your support. but otherwise you have individual freedoms, which sort of trumps everything in the society. And you know, when we talk about this system, we talk about the chieftainship titles, we talk about the Great Law of Peace, the organization of the Confederacy as a government, as a participatory democracy, and we say, oh, that had an impact on the American form of democracy. And I think probably there was probably some influence that took place, but I think more importantly was this sense of individual freedoms and individual rights over yourself, your family, and what you do that had a greater impact on the American ideas of individualism and freedom than any political system. Because if you remember, half of the political system was women. And in 1776, and when the United States was formed, the Constitution didn't include women really in that process. So anyways, so what these men do, this warrior class, because they're you know, free, it's really interesting. I'll explain that when they bring the mat to war, it's a physical mat, and I'm going to read to you a little bit about what an accounting of going to war. What does it mean? Okay, so the war chief stands up and sings his war chant. Each of them has his own special song. He recounts all his exploits, strikes his fist against a post, and throws down a pledge to guarantee what he had said. He speaks of all the nations against whom he has fought, pointing with his hatchet in the direction where they're situated. He announces his plan. With threatening an air with as threatening an air as he can manage, and invites those who are courageous to follow him. He ends by throwing disdainfully to the ground a belt of black wampum with red paint on it, inviting those men with pluck to pick it up, and announcing that he will award it to the man who shows himself to be the bravest. All the young men sit in a circle with a rhythmic hit, hit, which acts as a refrain to the song. So this is the famous striking the post ceremony, and it was used to kind of bring an energy to whatever with this endeavor, this war party that you're trying to form. And the song that he sings is something they called a dunwa, and it was all a part of this kind of like, you know, kind of whipping people up and getting people excited about it, particularly other men who might follow you. And striking the post was a ritualized way of sort of expressing that energy, that impact that you're going to strike your enemy at that post. The post also ended up being the place where you might sacrifice a dog for your endeavor, to clothe, what they say, to clothe the creator in your endeavor with the hide of the dog. And all of that took place, in this in particular from the mid-18th century, from Peugeot, when that took place, that all goes on today. But after 1799, all those ceremonies were turned from warlike and war-focused into peace. And so today, often, Haudenosaunee men will perform the Adunwa in ceremony. And so my son performs it, you know, and he does it today. It's like a continuation. So it has its roots in this old ritualized war activity, but today it's something new for a new age, and men's chant still goes on, and you still hear the men say hit, hit, hit. It's the same thing. So when the chief is finished, the first man to make up his mind stands and goes through the same ceremony. He sings his war song, enumerates his exploits as he strikes the post, throws down pledges as a guarantee. Still singing, picks up the belt and brandishing it, claims that he'll be worthy of winning it. He throws it down again, and as they make up their minds, all the others stand up and go through the same ceremony. Those who do not want to join the war party drink but don't dance. Once the ceremony is over, all those who are to participate go and dress themselves as warriors. They strip down to their breechcloths. They smear their bodies in a reddish-brown color, the ochre, with stripes that they make with their fingers. They cut their hair, or rather they remove it around the top knot. They decorate their faces, covering it with vermilion, over which they throw white down, which is the sign that they're going off to make war. As soon as they're all assembled, they march out together, their instruments in their hands. They dance in a circle and go from hut to hut, singing a tune which always ends in ha ha, he he, he, etc. They turn circles around another, and with their tomahawks or knives in their hands gesticulate a great deal. People give them little presents, and during this time the girls follow them everywhere, dancing with them in loose-limbed fashion throughout the evening, as is mentioned above. Everyone tries to treat them as well as possible. This lasts for several days, right up to the time they set out. Then they stand in single file, with the chief, the war chief at the head, preceded by the youngest warrior, carrying the medicine mat in which there is either a bird or an animal that each war chief selects as his totem. In the mat there are also a few medicinal herbs for wounds or sicknesses. They have a great deal of respect for this mat, which always precedes them when they are on the march. And that's how the warriors leave the community. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
You were saying that they were chosen by the women to be the Sachems. Was there a way to remove Sachems that weren't doing the job the women liked?
Yeah, the process, they go into, there's 3 stages. So the first stage, okay, each clan mother, you're getting into the weeds here, but I'll explain. The clan mother typically has a male, almost like an adjutant, right? And so the first step is she sends him to the Sachem, and he says, well, listen, she says you're not doing what she's asked you to do. You got to change your ways, and has like a little counseling session with him. He goes back, and then if he still is, not on the right path, then she goes with her adjutant together, and they sit down and they talk to him for a second time. And if he still is like not following her directives, the last time, third and last time, she comes with all the other clan mothers and their adjutants. They go to him and take back the title from him. You get 3 chances, 3 strikes and you're out.
Is that given to somebody else?
I'm sorry?
Can they give that position to someone else then?
They have to. They have to. There are 50 seats. They all must be filled to have a perfectly functioning system. So empty seats, you typically, a Sachem has somebody who is with them, a junior that is a likely candidate for the next seat holder. That person might sit in that seat temporarily until they can be installed in a formal way, or there's another person has to be chosen, But that has to happen. You can't have open seats.
Thanks, great talk. I just was trying to get a sense of how regularly the council might meet. I know you said they're quite stationary a lot of the time. Are there set times for Confederacy councils?
So there are. Today, every month, okay? But long ago, it was probably every day. There was some kind of a meeting with somebody every day.
That'd be local.
Yeah, it depends on the level. So if you have, if it's like, in your town, so like the Senecas had 2 branches in a way, Eastern and Western, and the Western branches were more or less doorkeeper towns. We're getting into the weeds. I didn't want to get too deep, but the Eastern ones were more or less peace chiefs, and they would meet together more often because they were closer geographically. And then if they had a decision which required all the Seneca chiefs to come together, they would. But if it was only initiated by a need to meet. But the Grand Council had to be in communication monthly, whether that was in person or using proxies or runners, it depends. It's very difficult to travel in the winter long ago, and probably they weren't doing it, gathering. But when they did, they met at Onondaga, which is more or less centrally located. Today, their territory is like near Syracuse. Anciently, the same thing, right around Onondaga Lake. So